Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome my friend Peter Grossman. He is the author of U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure. Peter, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Well, thank you, Robert. I'm delighted to be here and to be discussing this with you.
Now, I didn't warn you, Peter, but guests on the podcast introduce themselves. So you have a long CV. If you don't mind, imagine you've arrived somewhere and you don't know anyone and you have, say, 45 or 60 seconds to introduce yourself. Please, go.
Okay. Yes, I'm Peter Grossman. I'm the Clarence Ephraimson Professor of Economics Emeritus at Butler University in Indianapolis. I have a PhD in economics, and that probably disqualifies me in the eyes of some people. But I started out as a journalist. Excuse me. Started out as a journalist and was writing mainly magazine articles when I decided to go back to school and get a doctorate. But I continue to write things that actual people, as opposed to economists, can read. And so I've written about, I don't know, maybe 150 or more op-eds over the last 20 years. And the book was meant to be for general readers, but it's got things like graphs in it. and I had a friend who we urged that she read the book, and she wrote an email back saying she started it, but there are graphs, there are charts. And I said, well, yeah. I don't know that she ever finished it. And
well, here's the book. It's
really meant to be a textbook,
right? So just one quick thing I'm getting a little feedback, a little noise on is there something hitting your computer there or something? There was just some scratching noise or something, but
it might have been my hand.
Okay. So this is the book. It's U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure. It came out in 2013. So this is not a new book, but we've known each other for a while. You've published other books as well, right? You have two other. In Came the Darkness. You published in the 70s after the blackouts.
Yes, well, actually, 81.
81. Okay.
And that was a book that was meant for kids ages
Right.
10 to 14, and it was about the blackouts, which I was sort of in the midst of back in 1978, I guess it is.
Right.
And there was looting, and there was all sorts of craziness going on in the streets below my window in my apartment in New York at the time. And so I decided that I wanted to write something. So I saved a whole mass of articles about it. And sure enough, I was asked to write a book for a children's book. And the proposed book was not possible for me to read, the one that they suggested that I write. So I suggested, well, how about one about the blackouts?
Right.
And they thought that was great. And so in came the darkness.
So the reason I wanted to have you on, Peter, you've obviously been writing about the energy business for a very long time now. And even though this book, U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure, came out 9 years ago, came out in 2013, well, I wanted to talk to you because it sure seems relevant now, and in terms of where the U.S. is in terms of energy policy. But let's back up, and I want to talk about what your history, which really starts with the Carter administration after the first during the oil shocks. But what led you to write this book? And now it's more than 10 years ago when you were writing it. But what was the thing that spurred you then to look at this?
Well, at the time I was a professor of economics, and I was also a regular columnist for the Indianapolis Star. And so I started writing about things I knew about with respect to economics. It had to have some economic elements to it. And so I started writing about energy again, and also did a couple scholarly things on energy, and did a number of articles about energy, and I decided as I looked closely at it that in fact the books that I had written back in the a textbook that I co-authored back in the 80s was not really right. There was something that was missing. And so I decided I wanted to write a book that was focused on energy policy. That textbook in the 80s, Introduction to Energy, was already entering its third edition. And so I contacted the editor at Cambridge, because that is also a Cambridge book, and wrote a prospectus as to what I would be writing about in a book about energy policy. And they agreed to it. And so I started writing it. And then I had to deal with the congressional record and the various sources in the libraries of past presidents. And, I'm just grateful that I came out of it without a neurological disorder, because reading that stuff is really, well, it was crazy and also often funny. I mean, except for the fact that it was costing the country billions of dollars, that they kept making these foolish kinds of mistakes and learned nothing from the past. They went around, that is the policymakers, people in Congress, in the bureaucracy, president, and so on. They kept making the same kind of mistakes. So I said, well, I really need to look at this closely. And I did, starting in, I believe, 09 or 08, when I had a sabbatical. And then I started writing it. And there it is in your hand.
Well, and it's the most thorough book that I know of that documents this now 5 decades of congressional moves and executive orders and so on that are looking at energy policy. But what you make the point that there's a long string of failures going from oil shale, right? Today we're talking about shale oil shale, corn ethanol, fusion. You cite at the very beginning a bill in 1980. You cite Jim Wright, a congressman from Fort Worth, where he says that they passed the Magnetic Fusion Energy Engineering Act of 1980, and Wright declared, this may well rank alongside the great discoveries of history, the discovery of fire and the discovery of electric power. Now, that's 42 years ago. But what you make the point, I think that the key that you talk about here is that the push has always been that policymakers have to do something, right? They can't just leave this alone. And is that the nut of it? Is that the I'm not going to say the root of all evil, but the root of all this bad policy is this motivation of, well, we have to do something?
I think that there's a lot to that. One of the things that happens when there's an energy crisis, because most of the policies that have been enacted over the past 40 odd years, 50 years, I guess now, that most of the major changes came about during or in the aftermath of an energy crisis, or so-called energy crisis, because a couple of them, although they were called energy crisis, don't seem to add up to anything that most people would think of as a crisis. Although anytime people were mating in gas lines, you could call it something an energy crisis, and most of the country would go along with you because they were very unhappy about the present situation.
Right.
But one of the things about energy policy is that, as you well know for sure, and probably most of your listeners know, energy can be a very complex and thorny kind of issue. It's a real big kind of issue where you have technological issues that are hard to understand unless you spend a lot of time trying to learn them. Social issues, other kinds of philosophic issues, moral questions even. In fact, I would just say, look at your books and you see just how difficult energy policy can be, how many areas it encompasses.
Right.
And people in Congress really don't understand it, and nor do presidents. It's pretty clear from what they say. And the the upshot is that they wind up making big leaps when things are disastrous, and they feel that they have to do something. I call it the do something dilemma,
Uh-huh.
where they have to act. And in fact, it's to me a three-step process. One is that they have to engage right away. They have to say, "Oh, this is awful. We can't have the price of oil being or the price of gasoline being $5 at the pump." Uh, well, we know that won't happen.
Right.
But immediately they have to engage. They will make resolutions in Congress. They'll make speeches, and if the crisis goes away, which it often does, the momentary crisis goes away, then they just forget about it and they move on to something else. If it persists, then people begin to start introducing various kinds of legislation, or the president begins to contemplate executive orders, and the bureaucracy says we need to do this, and so on. And after it, that will play itself out if, in fact, the crisis situation ends naturally after a few months.
Right.
But if it persists, as it did in '79, as it did in '07, '08, that then you start getting really radical proposals. And in fact, often the results, you'll get radical kinds of policies being enacted. I mean, in '79, '80, we wound up with the Synfuels Corporation, which was supposed to replace, if I remember correctly, 2 million barrels a day of imported oil by turning coal into an oil substitute, synthetic oil. In '07, it was ethanol. That was going to be the panacea of the year, and it was going to be made from switchgrass and other kinds of things that it would be viable by 2012, I believe, if I remember George Bush's.
That's right. Yeah, that the ethanol that was going to cure the imported oil issue, and that was
Right.
and this was the national security hawks. I wrote I have a whole book that I published in 2008 about the gusher of lies, the dangerous delusions of energy independence.
Yes.
But it was the national security hawks, James Woolsey. They had these other functionaries who signed this Set America Free proposition, but it was all based around biofuels. There's just this incredible push for biofuels that still now is lingering today. But anyway, so you're saying that this do something dilemma, that's the motivator. So, but handicap this for me then, if you don't mind, because I want to read some of these things about hydrogen, because you talk about hydrogen in the book as well.
Mm-hmm.
What's been the biggest flop? I mean, now grade it for me here. Give me you write about ethanol, you talk about biofuels, hydrogen, synfuels, fuel cells. There's a whole bunch of examples in the book, but is it possible to high grade them here to say this program failed the most or the most spectacularly?
Well, I think that probably the most spectacular failure was synfuels.
Uh-huh.
But probably the worst bill was ethanol, because we're still living with it, and it has been a drain on everything for the past 15 years, and it has such a large constituency that I don't see it ever being repealed like they did with the Synfuels Corporation.
And that constituency is the Iowa primary for president, right? And Iowa as a swing state, but it's also the farm lobby, and but I haven't liked. I understand the arguments around ethanol as a oxygenate, right, and fuel, but
Right.
you can also synthesize that from natural gas. There's other ways to produce oxygenates. But this idea that we're burning food to make motor fuel, I still hate that. And I haven't written anything about ethanol for a while. I probably should, but so you say okay. So I've asked you to high grade them, rank them. So you say ethanol, then cellulosic ethanol. I guess it's corn or cellulosic, it's a tie. But okay. So what would rank second, third? Can you handicap them then?
Oh, gee, I've never thought of this before, but
see, I bring you on the podcast here at Grossman to put you on the spot.
Well, all right, I'll give it a shot. Let's see. Possibly the next worst policy was the giving the pricing of natural gas to the Federal Power Commission. That was back in 1954.
Ah, okay.
And within 17 years, there was a belief that it engendered a belief that, and a belief that lasted for another 15 years, that we were running out of natural gas. And it was actually banned for electric power generation.
Yeah.
By the 1978 Power Plant
and Industrial Fuel Use Act that was sponsored by Robert Byrd, right? That this was
well,
that's good. So I just want to recount. So synfuels would be first, then ethanol second, and then federal price controls on natural gas. But that even goes back to the almost 70 years to the 1950s.
Yeah, that's almost 70 years. In fact, in some way, it goes back to the 30s because there was this dispute over natural gas pricing. And natural gas pricing also produced some of the unintentionally funniest debates in Congress, where the various senators were arguing over whether the price of natural gas should be set at $1.50 per 1,000 cubic feet. No, someone said it should be no greater than 130, and they're having this argument about what the price of natural gas should be. In fact, if you decontrol it, you'll find out what it is, what the actual demand is, and what the price would be set at by the marketplace. But
it's interesting you bring up the gas part of it, because I wrote about that in the push to deregulate it, and under the Reagan administration, which was successful and I think was important and much needed, but that the interstate price controls during the late 70s, Texas was awash in gas. There was no shortage of gas, but there was a shortage of gas that could move across state lines, be traded in the interstate market. And because there were limitations on that, or price controls on that, you had states that were massively short of gas and other states that were awash in gas, but it was because of excessive government meddling in the marketplace. Is that a fair assessment?
Right.
Yeah.
And the result was that the places that were short of gas were in somewhat desperate straits during the 70s, because there were a couple of very harsh winters,
right?
And people were cut off from natural gas, or had it rationed. I can't remember exactly what the situation was, but it was not.
I'm still getting a little rustling noise, Peter. Is that on your desk there, or just?
I'll keep my hands off my desk.
No problem. So let me. So that's great. I'm glad to get your list of the worst policies that have been enacted.
By the way, for the next one, it would have been oil price controls, I suppose, because that certainly was up there among the worst of the worst.
And that was in the Nixon administration, which led to really, people talked about OPEC and the OPEC oil embargo being the cause of the shortages. No, the problem was that there were federal price controls on the price of gasoline, and the refiners couldn't make money with the price controls, right?
And also, by the way, the solution to that, and I should put solution in scare quotes, solution to that was allocation controls, which
rationing.
Was as stupid a response as one can make. It's okay, we're not getting enough oil or enough gasoline around? Well, let's just decide where it goes. And what do we use to decide? We'll use what they used last year. Well, that really was about as bad an idea as one can get. And they got rid of the initial allocation controls, but substituted something that was almost as bad. And the result was that we had a second energy crisis in the late 70s, where gas lines once again were the story around the country.
Right. Well, so I want to come back to this idea of the markets and federal price controls and something, because that's something the Biden administration has even floated in recent days, talking about, oh, we're going to implement price controls. But you didn't mention hydrogen, so I'll just recount.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
synfuels, ethanol or biofuels. What was the third one? It was natural gas price controls, and then oil price controls would be the top four. But I was intrigued too by what you wrote in the book about hydrogen, and you pointed out that was in, let me just find it here right quick, because I wanted to read it. Oh yes, the final bill you're talking about, one of the the bills that was passed during the George W. Bush administration. Final bill included funds for Bush's hydrogen project, but nothing about ANWR. You just point out that that Bush announced somewhat out of the blue a $1.2 billion initiative to create a car powered by hydrogen fuel cells. This idea was entirely quixotic, given that there were enormous technical problems to overcome to make such a vehicle commercially viable. And experts argued that commercialization would take decades. So I went back and did some research in advance of our discussion, and I found a 1979 report from the National Academy of Sciences. Quote, cost considerations presently inhibit the use of hydrogen as a fuel. It is by no means certain that a widespread market for hydrogen as a fuel will materialize until it is forced by hydrocarbon limitations. Another report, 2004, by the National Academies. There are major hurdles on the path to achieving the vision of the hydrogen economy, blah, blah, blah. And yet today, we see these academics, particularly from Columbia University, say, oh, hydrogen, and all these push for hydrogen. That would be, in my view, one of the other ones that's like, well, what is it make? So here's the question. Why is hydrogen so attractive? What is it about this energy carrier that just keeps coming back over and over again for now, 42 years?
Doesn't create pollution. That's, I think, the main argument for it. But what you were referring to is something that's really been ubiquitous with respect to energy policy, and that is that the people who are proposing this in Congress or presidents really don't have any idea of what the feasibility is with technical, and they often ignore reports that say it's not really feasible. Carter had to ignore 5 different reports from inside his own government saying that the synfuels idea was not going to be viable. Bush obviously was not poring over the reports about hydrogen
from the National Academy.
From the National Academy. And so that it seems that feasibility and results. There's also no, what happens if, okay, you make something that allows for hydrogen cars to become viable. Not that that's likely to happen anytime soon, but let's say you solve the technological problems, you deal with economic problems, and you deal with, you come up to the point of saying, okay, now what do we get? Okay, we get hydrogen cars, hydrogen powered cars.
Right.
How much is this benefit? In what way is this benefiting? How do we measure whether or not it's a really good thing? There's no metric that in any of this, and it's true right now of the Biden administration's energy proposals. What is the metric that's going to tell us that if, in fact, they were to do all the stuff that was in that bill that was Build Back Better about climate, what were the metrics going to be? How are we going to tell whether that we've spent money wisely? There's nothing in there that really, I mean, that it is entirely possible we could spend trillions of dollars. It would have no effect whatsoever, no discernible effect on the climate, and would essentially forestall a lot of. I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background, so I don't know if you're picking it up, but anyway, so there's no way of determining whether you've got a good program or not,
Right.
and they don't care about it. And in the do something dilemma framework, what differences it make, what the results are, because the results are going to be at least probably not out until at least through the next election cycle. So.
So the do something just so overwhelms that.
What differences make? We've done something. You know, there was a quote in '79. I think I put it somewhere here, in which Representative Peter Pizer, during a debate about the energy policy, Carter's energy policy proposals, he said a friend wrote him a letter saying, you know, if the Congress was only doing something, even if it was long term, it would make a lot easier waiting in these gas lines.
Uh-huh.
So, in other words, as long as Congress, this really encapsulated what the policymakers in the government then and now really see as the important thing about energy policy. It's not the results. It's that constituents see that they're doing something.
That's interesting.
Anything.
Right.
In July or June, I can't remember which one, of '79, one of Carter's aides went up on Capitol Hill and found that the members of Congress were terrified to go back for July 4th festivities because they were afraid of their constituents. This aide of Jakarta wrote a memo saying that in Congress, they want some action taken, even if it's wrong.
What is that, HL? What is that line about? There's always an easy solution that's obvious, something else, and wrong, or something like that, right? But that's a good anecdote.
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said, when writing the book, I burst out laughing every now and then, but then I reflect on the fact that they were actually doing something wrong in the process of saying things that were very, very silly to me, at least.
Right. But they had to have that impression of doing something that was going to, whether right, wrong, or indifferent. One of the things that is, as I was going back over your book, Peter, I pulled out my book. Now, this is my advertisement for my book from 2010. But it ties in with what we're talking about here, because this idea of doing something, the do something-ism, it also allows Congress then to pass the money around, right? And that's the other part of this. And so I just in the appendix in my book, I included this headed is America's Convoluted Energy Regulatory Structure. And I've noted that in 1971, the Christian Science Monitor estimated there were 48 federal agencies and 14 congressional committees that had some hand in federal energy policy. And then in 2009, the U.S. Chamber said that there were 24 federal agencies and 25 congressional committees playing roles in shaping energy policy. So export, import, bank, commerce, defense, ag, health and human services, homeland security, justice, state, interior, treasury, transportation. The doing something, you say, well, we're doing something, but it's also a chance for a little baksheesh around to spread the money around different favored constituencies. How big a role is that in all of this? You mentioned the corn ethanol scam. How big a role has this issue, is the ability to spread the money around that drives this failed energy policy?
Well, that's a good question, because obviously Uh, One of the things that happens, one reason we get passage of various bills or executive orders is to reward various groups who've
Right.
been helpful, and you certainly can see that in a lot of cases. Ethanol being the obvious one. I remember uh, Charles Grassley from Iowa, of all places,
Sure.
once we gave a speech and said, "Some people say ethanol is bad. I'm here to say it's good, good, good." And okay, it's good, good, good. He should have finished the sentence for me if it passes and I get reelected.
Right. Because
But
I'm from Iowa, and my constituents are a lot of farmers, and they have a lot of money, and Archer
right.
Daniels Midland and the rest of the ag industrial complex gives me a lot of money to make sure ethanol stays in place. It's interesting. Grassley was also the father of the production tax credit for the wind energy business, which now has been
Yeah.
extended
Well,
13 times, and the solar and wind crowd are trying to get that.
and as you know, there's a lot of wind energy in wind projects in Iowa, or at least there were, and there there are fewer that are being built now because of as you pointed out on numerous occasions, the resistance of people to large utility scale solar and wind
Projects. Yeah.
projects.
Well, you're in
So,
Indianapolis. I mean, Butler, you've been at Butler for a long time. I mean, you see the similar kind of rejections in Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin.
mhm.
Those states have been among really in the front lines, as well as Iowa, in this backlash. And I just published a piece in Real Clear Energy about it, 344 rejections over the past decade or so of wind, and the solar stuff is getting much more opposition now. So, what do you think about the Biden administration? We've talked about this, and I've written about it some, in not flattering terms, but I'll stop and ask the question. So, if you look now, you're the dean of historians on American energy policy. You've got a view back now to the Carter administration. I don't know how many presidents we've had then since then, or even Reagan. How does the Biden administration compare in terms of its rhetoric around energy policy relative to other administrations?
Oh, that's a good question. In many ways, I think this is the worst. I mean, at least in terms of the rhetoric, because the attempt is to gin up a crisis in which essentially the crisis is, if we don't do something, we're all going to die, because it's an existential crisis, right?
Yeah.
It's something that we live or die. If we don't change the energy system in the United States, I mean, usually we can say, all right, we change some aspect of energy in the United States, and it rewards some people and it's bad for other people and so on. But with the kind of Green New Deal Junior that the Biden administration has been pushing, it's so grandiose and so implausible that I think Carter would have been blushing if he had tried to present these things. And Carter thought that his energy policy would cure the malaise of the American spirit, as well as 50 or 60 other things. I mean, every energy proposal has somewhere between hundreds of thousands and millions of jobs. Every energy proposal has all sorts of benefits for trade and for the economy and so on, most of which is just pulled out of nowhere. But the Biden administration is really the epitome of not asking about the technical feasibility, the economic cost, and the likely results of anything that they've proposed. And while somebody wrote in on the Hill alongside your excellent article, by the way, that the Green New Deal is dead. That was, I think, the title of the piece.
Right.
And Build Back Better, where it was going to be incorporating a fair amount of that, it is probably dead. But in the meantime, you have a new bill that was introduced by Bernie Sanders in the Senate with a number of prominent co-sponsors, which is called the Energy Security and Independence Act of 2022. So 19. I show what century I'm from. This bill is really a different version of the Green New Deal. But the interesting thing is the focus of it is on building manufacturing capability in the U.S. For wind and solar. In other words, we won't buy windmills from China anymore. We won't buy solar panels from China anymore. And $100 billion to start with would be the amount. Oh, wow. And of course, there's other stuff in there about environmental justice and so on that is very amorphous.
Right.
But let's just look at the basic plan. It says we're going to have this big manufacturing capability for producing tens of thousands of windmills and millions of solar panels. There's nothing in there about opening mining so that the raw materials that are essential to creating the manufactured goods,
right,
would have to be imported from China or Congo or wherever. And so we're really still in the same place, except that we've spent $100 billion to build some factories whose rationale seems pretty slender, if not completely wrong.
So where does that come from? So where does that come from, Peter? I mean, because it's this, we've talked about do something dilemma, but is it a willing blindness? Is it purposeful? Is it just wishful thinking? I mean, we've talked about this before offline and in different discussions around from where does this kind of magical thinking come? Or is it purposeful ignorance, or is it just true ignorance?
Well, I think I'll give Bernie the benefit of the doubt, and also Markey and who else who have signed on to this, that they really believe the world is imperiled, and if we don't do something drastic, the climate crisis will overtake us and will destroy us. So they see a crisis. They see the worst crisis, and so does Biden. I mean, he's used existential crisis a lot.
Right.
And if you have these kinds of crises, well, if you can convince people that there's a crisis and that it's dire and something must be done immediately of great cost and expense, that you really believe that this stuff is important and we need to pass a bill like this, or, as I said before, we're all going to die. And none of that makes much sense to anyone looking at the data. Anyone who tries to calculate how much it would cost and how many windmills you would need and so on to replace, 3,000 plus power plants that are fossil fuel power plants that exist in the U.S. right now. I believe you've done some work with this, and I know there's some other people have, in which they've tried to calculate the cost of actually installing, and maintaining this incredibly vast array of windmills and solar panels that would actually replace all of the fossil fuel electric plants in the United States.
Right.
That the cost is like $300 trillion and it probably would still cost more than that, and would take far more than we're talking about 12 years or something. That used to be 20, 2030. Now I think it's 2035 and
Right.
2050.
Yeah,
And that'll
those
be pushed
estimates,
out again.
right, those estimates vary, I mean, dramatically, right? And one that I just cite routinely is one from Wood Mackenzie, and I think it was from 3 years ago or so now, but they estimated to go to all renewable, just electricity would be 4.5 trillion. Now that's a far smaller number than what you, but in a certain respect, in my view, some of these cost estimates really don't matter because you're still ignoring the first principles, which is where are you going to put it, right? Where, if you're going to attempt this kind of renewable push, where in the United States are you going to put all of those wind turbines and solar panels at a time when you see just such backlash? But I'm
Well,
biased on this because this is obviously what I've been
but
writing about for a long time.
it also talks to this feasibility question.
Right.
Can you really actually set up all these wind farms and thousands? It's really thousands of windmills, and where are you going to put them? Where are you going to put all the access roads? Where are you going to put the power towers with high voltage
Transmission?
lines?
Yeah.
Thousands of miles of high voltage lines. None of this is really being considered. Certainly not in Bernie's bill, and I don't think he understands it even. I mean, there have been times when he's said things about economics where it was clear he didn't understand what the issues were.
Sure. As you said, that one thought that popped in my head, and I'm looking at the forward strip for natural gas prices in Europe, and one of the guests on the podcast I've had is Art Berman, who's a energy analyst based in Houston, and one thing he said it just popped in my head as you were talking about that. He said, "Energy is the economy. Oil is the economy." And it sure looks like that in Europe now. I mean, you're trained as an economist. You've obviously, not front row seat for what's going on in Europe, but how do you view what's going on in Europe? And is there any hope in the near term for what's happening there? Their natural gas prices are over $50 per MMBTU now. That's 10x what it is in the United States. What do you see as you look at Europe?
Well, one of the things about energy, people talk about energy security and the fact that we need to be sure that we're going to have energy supplies. But what often it comes along with the question about paying or importing or paying some country or a group of countries for their energy supplies, for their resources.
Right.
But in terms of energy security, the one thing that really stands out as being an insecure and problematic thing is to be importing all your key or most of your key energy resources from one place.
Right.
And with natural gas, that's been true for a lot of Europe, that they get it primarily from Russia. And that's a condition which will be problematic or can be problematic. One of the things, back in the 70s, people were defining what it meant to be energy independent. And we know a lot of that was nonsense.
Right.
But one of the people who was defining his version of what energy independence meant was William Simon, who was Treasury Secretary under Ford. And he said that, energy independence would mean if we had many suppliers. We were had too much coming to us from OPEC, especially from the Arab OPEC countries.
Right.
So if we not got rid of them completely, but had alternatives, that would mean we would be energy independent in some sense.
Huh.
Now, of course, that's one of about 50 different definitions of what energy independence is. But it does suggest that energy security, at least in the sort of most basic way of having energy resources when you need them, that essentially Europe violated that basic maxim And they're paying for it right now, and both paying in terms of money and in terms of really being in a very dicey situation for production, for survival, even. As we know, that extreme weather events, for example, may become an issue for Germany, for various other parts of Europe, if they rely on Russia to provide them with energy, or
Yeah.
with natural resources, with natural gas in particular.
Sure.
Uh,
As you're saying that, one
so,
of the things that pops into my head too is that famous Churchill line that energy security lies in variety and variety alone, right? That was he was talking
yeah,
about oil supplies for the British Navy in 1908 or something like that. But yeah, but I mean Europe just hitched their entire wagon, their entire energy fortunes to Russia, and now they are in, I mean, a world of hurt.
yeah.
But just a quick station break. My guest is Peter Grossman. He's a longtime friend of mine and had been a great advisor and kind of a consultant to me on different things I've been writing. He's the author of U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure, which now has been out 9 years, but this book is very much relevant today because of what's going on. You, in one of your last chapters, or maybe it is your last chapter, that it's called Modesty.
Mhm.
And you argue for modesty in policymakers. You crack me up. But you do call for some policymakers when they come to energy that they should be more modest. And I could probably find that quote. But what do you mean by they need modesty? And you also want a second question. You also say we should reform or abolish the Department of Energy. Why?
Okay, well, let's take the first question
Sure.
first. Modesty means that you don't think that you have the magic bullet for solving not just all energy problems, but for solving employment and the environment, happiness, even.
Yeah.
That the grandiosity in energy proposals is really a point to me of very poorly thought out ideas. How can you actually imagine that by uh, putting up more windmills, you are actually solving problems like, I mean, right now we don't really have serious unemployment problems, but supposedly we're going to create 6 million new jobs if we start putting up more windmills and build the manufacturing capability that Bernie's bill talks about. So that's what I mean when I talk about modesty. Let's say, what can we actually accomplish through energy policy? And what is energy? Let's start with that one. What do we mean by energy policy? Does it mean that we're solving the malaise in the country? Does it mean that we're actually solving any employment problems? Does it mean that we're going to make the climate change problems go away? I mean, the idea that even the name, I mean, California called its 2006 bill the Global Warming Solutions Act and it's just so ridiculous. It's so beyond anything that the whole United States can do, much less California.
Right.
And so I think grandiosity is really a problem in energy policy, and it's been going on since Nixon proposed Project Independence back in 74, 73, 74.
Right.
He was going to make America completely self-sufficient in energy. We won't depend on anybody else, etc. And as long as we treat it like the Apollo program, we need an Apollo program for energy. We need recently we need a Operation Warp Speed for alternative energy. No, we can't get that kind, because energy is a different problem from putting a man on the moon. In fact, I think it was Mark Mills suggested, no, it's not putting a man on the moon. It's like creating a city on the moon and moving 1 million people there.
Right.
Something like that.
I'll interrupt here because you have a section called Apollo in the book, and I highlighted it here. And you talk about this idea of, you say, energy problems have too often been viewed through the prism of Apollo, seeing in the creation of new energy technologies the image of men walking on the moon and the determined effort that got them there. By the way, if you haven't watched Chasing the Moon, Robert Stone's film, it's just fantastic. It's, I think, 6 hours, 3-part series. It came out in 2019, but I just watched it. It's incredible. But here I'm reading from your book again here. The trouble with this image, we're talking about Apollo here, is that it is the wrong one. The difficulty of creating a commercially viable solar energy technology bears no relationship whatsoever to the problem of putting a man on the moon. However spectacular the latter, it only misleads when applied to energy policy. It conflates a demonstration with commercialization, an engineering feat with a marketing one, a thrilling idea with everyday mundane market exchange. I call this the Apollo fallacy. It's great. There's a great line about just how you put that together. I like the way you wrote it, but I hear that the same thing. Oh, well, we just need an Apollo. If only we applied ourselves more, if only we really focused on this, we'd solve it. All of which ignores the problems of scale, cost, material availability, all these other things that we've been discussing.
Oh, those are important, right?
Yeah. Oh, those neodymium iron boron magnets. Oh, well, never mind. China controls 92% of the market. We'll make our own market here. Well, how are you gonna do that?
Exactly. Yeah, the Apollo fallacy is something that I started. Actually, I had a scholarly piece on that in 08, I think, or 07. I was just really sick and tired of people making that claim that all we need. I think it was Thomas Friedman in the New York Times.
Oh, right.
Wrote an editorial in which he said, if only George Bush would come and before America and say, we're going to become energy independent by 2016.
Right.
Oh, if only he would do that. And I thought to myself, everybody said that. Nixon said that.
Yeah, I know. Going back to 40 years before, right.
And where did it get us? I mean, it's just, oh, yes, okay, gung-ho, we put a man on the moon. Okay, that was really great. But it doesn't tell us anything about the difficulty and the issues involved in creating creating completely new electric grid and a replacement for internal combustion engines.
Right. In transportation. Yeah.
Yeah. Those issues are not ones that can be solved by a big engineering push. It's a lot of the issues relating to energy and especially to alternative energy, which they're often talking about. I have problems of physics, and those problems are intractable. They're not going to be solved because we throw more money at it.
So let me ask about one question here, Peter, and my guest again is Peter Grossman. He's the author of U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure. We've talked about, markets, and you advocate for more markets and allowing markets to have a more say in how and where we, put our energy and power systems. But is the electricity business fundamentally different? I mean, this is something we've talked about at different times, and I've written about that. There's the electricity is not like the natural gas market. So I'll ask the question: has deregulation of electricity benefited the consumer? Because or is it just a different kind of energy service, or it is a different form of energy that we have to treat differently than we treat the oil market, the natural gas market, coal market, et cetera?
Well, I think that's an important question. I have written in the past that electricity markets should be decontrolled and allowed to be a marketization, except perhaps for the grid itself. But obviously, all of the attempts that are to make changes in electricity markets have been more or less failures, and sometimes really bad failures. Like in California, of course, California is the poster child for failure in energy policy. But even Texas, which was supposed to be the poster child for how energy markets could work, they didn't do so well a winter or so ago, as
Right.
you know from firsthand. Has it benefited the consumer? Well, to the extent that California is not a market system, you can see that that there were a lot of other factors that have led California to be one of the most expensive electricity states in the U.S.
Right.
And so I don't know. I probably would be qualifying any kind of a statement about electric power deregulation, real deregulation. I mean, California's deregulation bill in '96 was this. Well, how much more can I say?
It was a mess.
Well, one of the things that was in the bill, this is something that only legislators in California, probably, but maybe only legislators, period, would think of. And that is to say that the bill, electricity prices must be coming down, and the consumers' prices for consumers must be coming down, and they can't go up. And then we had a natural gas problem. So what did that mean in California? Disaster.
Right.
And bankrupt utilities and everything. A lot of people wanted to blame it on Enron, which certainly didn't come out of it with showering with glory. But basically, the law was there to be exploited by clever people at Enron.
Right.
And it all started with a very bad law. Now, it was in no sense, and a number of people said this at the time, in no sense was it a deregulation bill. It was just a re-regulation bill. So we're finding that changing around things is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And California is, how much more can I bash California? I was actually invited to once to go to California and to talk to members of the legislature about realistic energy policy. But there was I arrived, I was given a place to speak, and there were only a few people there. And someone said, well, unfortunately, just about 10 minutes ago, we got a notification that a major bill was coming up for a vote. So all the legislators left.
Right. And
so I talked to a few people who were there, who were part of the energy industry mostly, and went home. And I mentioned to someone that I was going to talk about energy policy. Of course, this was after my book had come out. I was going to California, and he said with a great passion, "That's a place where you really need to go. They really need to hear what you have to say." Well, they didn't.
Well, so just a couple last questions, then, Peter. So, what are you reading now? I know you've retired from Butler. I have a long career there, and But what any books on you've got a lot of books behind you there. What's on your bookshelf, or book stand, nightstand today?
Gee, I'm I started reading a history of Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe back in the 16th century.
Uh-huh.
What else have I been reading?
You recall the title on that one?
No.
Okay. Well, so last question then, Peter. It's the question I always ask my guests, and it's one that I like, obviously, or I wouldn't be persisting this way. So you've written a book that is frankly pretty sobering, and now 9 years out after it's published, it seems as relevant now as it was back then, or maybe more relevant given all the different energy issues that we're facing now. What gives you hope? What makes you optimistic?
That's a tough one, because one of the things that writing my book did was emphasize the negative and the fact that energy policy was such a mess. Someone once asked me at a talk that I gave, which president's energy policies did you like? And I took a long time to think about that one. Then I said, George Washington. he was good to his horse. But optimism, well, there is some reasons for optimism a bit. You, of course, have been one of the leaders of people's calling for a nuclear power rebirth. And I think that that's extremely important. To me, anyone who claims to care about climate change and is anti-nuclear is living in a completely self-contradictory kind of position. And so the fact that it's getting something like that is getting somewhere, I hope, that is a reason for optimism. As people get a more realistic view, I think also people are getting a more realistic view of what climate change is going to mean. It's not going to mean the end of humanity or the end of civilization in the next 8 years or even the next 80 years. But it's a problem we're probably going to need to deal with. And one way to deal with it, of course, is to get rid of carbon dioxide producing engines. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is with nuclear power. As people gain a little bit of realism in this, I have some hope that for the future that people will start looking at energy policy modestly and not believe that it's a silver bullet to change the world.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop then. Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful as well, and hopeful for nuclear. I'm trying to be as pragmatic and realistic as I can, but progress is made slowly. So,
yes.
Well, Peter, thanks as always for talking with me, and thanks for coming on the Power Hungry podcast. Again, my guest is Peter Grossman. He's a professor emeritus of economics at Butler University. And his book, that's my favorite, he's written several, but it's U.S. Energy Policy and the Pursuit of Failure, which is available at all fine booksellers. Peter, thanks again for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in for the next, next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, see ya.